Hi, thanks for joining me again. I'm Gary Zacharias, and you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. This is a book called Understanding the Times. Jeff Myers and David Noble are the authors. As it says on the back, you hold in your hands a landmark guide to understanding the ideas and forces shaping our times. It's a look at how does the Christian worldview compare with other worldviews. And you know me by now, I really like the idea of worldview, which is looking to see how other systems of thought and theology handle the big questions of life. So, how does Christianity do? For example, holding itself in opposition to Islam, secularism, Marxism, new spirituality, and postmodernism. Those are they see as the five major competing worldviews of our day. So, it's organized by topics, and then it goes through each of those worldviews to explain how those worldviews see it. So things like sociology and law and politics and economics and history and theology. And so I did, boy, that was a long time ago. I did an early podcast on biology, and we walked through those different worldviews to show the superiority of the Christian one. I thought maybe this time we could look at the world of ethics. The study of right and wrong, because that's huge these days. So it comes from the Greek word, they point out, meaning goodness. And it says ethics are trying to answer the question, how should we live? And of course, there's a worldview question. How should people live? What does it mean to live a good life? Not just something that feels good, because that could be anything. That could be drugs. That could be rock and roll. But so not just a life that feels good, but a life that actually is good. And then ethics proposes a way to think through what life is about. What's it all about, Alfie? There's an old song. So that's the idea. That's what ethics is all about. So they said, to start with, they said Christianity says all things good, true, and beautiful are based where? In God's character. And how do we find that? It's in nature and it's in Scripture. So, for example, we should be speaking truth not because we'll feel better or that it's reasonable or to help our society, but because it's God's nature is truth. And then how about justice? Well, we pursue justice not to keep us in power because the law commands it, we might be thrown in jail, but because God is just. We ought to express mercy, not because it's going to make us happy or it'll help our family, because God himself is merciful. So they say God is everywhere. That's what Christianity says. So an ethical system built on his character, based on his character, is going to reside in every one of us, across all cultures, at all times. And I think this is fascinating. You always hear people say, oh, that's just true for you. Or they'll say, well, the Hindus at one time, or the Egyptians, or whoever, that they had a different system, and they wouldn't agree with this. But a professor at George Washington University, I think he's retired now, Calvin Linton, he says there's a basic pattern of similarity among ethical codes. Things like murder, lying, adultery, cowardice, they're almost always condemned. And so it's interesting that there is a common moral heritage, he says, for all mankind. And that's odd, isn't it? Because if materialism or naturalism was true, if we just evolved and there was no God involved, seems like our ethical systems would all evolve differently. I mean, look at all the different animals. Isn't that the case? But Christians see this common ethical system across the world, and they say, well, even though it's among different cultures, that's evidence of a universal law. And then what do we have? If it's a universal law, there must be a universal lawmaker. So let me move ahead here in the chapter. They start then, after the kind of the big picture of Christianity, then they start in on each of the worldviews. So they start with secularism. So secularism just has a natural explanation for ethics. Since there's no God, here's one secularist: we have not found authoritative ethical prescriptions built into the order of things. So there's no God. Nature doesn't have any concern for good or bad or right or wrong. And so if nature has no concern, humans certainly do, and they're the only source of ethics, just us. There's no higher authority than human beings. So secularist ethics will end up being relative, either relative to you as an individual or maybe a relative to your culture. And it's going to be something like the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So it's either going to be moral relativism, they say, or utilitarianism. Secularists know, they say, that you got to make an ethical choice based on something. But what is that foundation? It says secularists kind of get stuck at this point because they don't want to end up with complete moral relativism. And so they struggle with that. So the question, can morality be achieved without the foundation of absolute religious beliefs? Well, they hope so, but they can't agree what morality means if you don't have God. Yeah. So that's hugely important. So we get moral relativism out of this, the idea that there's no absolute standard for ethics, that our ethics just come from our culture, maybe our individual situation. So they said secularists agree about two things. One, God has nothing to do with our morality or ethics. And second point, we're on our own. We're on our own. So we just crank it out ourselves and hope for the best. We just have to choose the right course. But they said, for example, thinking about love, right? We should choose the right course based on love, one of them says. But how does that help us if we don't have any real standard to recognize what love is? In fact, one secularist, based on his own understanding of love, he justified abortion and euthanasia. What about scientism? So if you say, all right, why don't we make the scientific method, have that be the basis of our belief system? Well, what does that really say? It says that scientific people are more intelligent, more moral. Really? We can trust them to do what's right? But as the authors point out, there sure is no evidence that higher intelligence makes more moral people. Now you think about the Marxists and the gas chambers of the Nazis. Scientism can get pretty sinister pretty quickly. So it says ethical debates are out there among secularists, and they're having a hard time trying to come up, once they've gotten away from an absolute standard of morality, how do you get a coherent philosophy out of that? And they struggle with it. All right, then they turn to Marxism. So how does Marxism do when it comes to ethics? Now, they don't have any problem making up their mind about ethics. Everything in the universe, and that includes our societies, everything's in a state of constant change. We're moving upward, right? Society's moving upward. We're going to eliminate all class distinctions. We'll move from capitalism to socialism, and that will change society's morality. Right? So anything that promotes this advancement, that's right, that's good, that's moral. Anything that hinders it is wrong. Wow. So Marxists do have moral ideals, but the ideals change when the circumstances change. They said the view of the Marxist is evolution is painful. It's going to be suffering and death, and there's going to be blood. Nature's going to accumulate the good, and unfortunately it's going to dispose of the bad. So that's what the struggle looks like as we move toward communism. The fit have to survive, and the unfit, along with their social institutions, are going to go. They're going to perish. So Marxism draws its inspiration from some kind of hope of a utopian, harmonious future, but the energy that it gets to get there is a whole bunch of grievances against the people who are in place. They said, take a look at somebody like using any means as far as morality goes. So think about Che Guevara. That was Fidel Castro's right-hand man during the Marxist revolution in Cuba. His diary rationalizes his radical change. And here's what somebody said about Che. Because remember, Che saw the bad conditions of the lower class, and he kind of ended up with an ends justified the means philosophy. And so a columnist said, the cult of Che is an episode in the moral callousness of our time. Che was a totalitarian. He achieved nothing but disaster. He presided over the Cuban Revolution's first firing squads. He founded Cuba's labor camp system. Says it's really sad, the present-day cult of Che, you can see him on T-shirts and bars and posters. That has succeeded. This is what Paul Berman, the columnist, says. This has succeeded in obscuring a dreadful reality. He set up an unjust social system in Cuba, and yet he's been erected into some kind of symbol of social justice. Yeah. So if you got evolution as kind of your building block, the Marxists felt it's perfectly okay to dump your moral standards because you have to go for something better. You're going to create a classless communist society. So you're going to dump any kind of morality along the way. And the two authors here of the book, they said, doubtless most Marxists will begin well. They do want to help the poor against injustice. That's good. That's a noble concern. But how do you address it? Right? The biblical view is incarnation. God comes into this world. And we walk alongside the people. We bring change through redemption. Here's another worldview. Let's move to the third one here, called New Spirituality. Now, what does it say when it comes to morality? Well, everything is consciousness, or God. So the good life, what's moral? You attain higher consciousness. So when each person does this, life is going to be better for all. So there's only one absolute ethical standard, complete freedom. You have to act in harmony with your own understanding of truth. Now, everybody's favorite New Ager, Shirley MacLaine, here's what she said. Free will is simply the enactment of the realization you are God, a realization that you are divine. Free will is making everything accessible to you. So to the new spiritualist, ethics happens where? In you, inside you. It's not the result of a divine command from God. It's not what society wants. It's internalized. One new spiritualist, he converted to Christianity. His name is Randall Bear. He said the new spiritualist credo is, create your own reality according to what feels right for you. Boy, what does the Bible say about that? It just makes me cringe. The Bible says our hearts are wicked. And this says, do whatever feels right for you. So, you are the truth, they say. If you're looking for it elsewhere, you can be deceived. That's really sad. Okay, so let's see if there's anything else on the new spiritualists here that's interesting. Tolerance. Okay, they're really big on tolerance. They withhold judgment about morality because the truth is in each side of us. So, they said, I wonder what new spiritualists would say about people like Genghis Khan and Torquemada and Adolf Hitler. So we're supposed to have our own individual morality? So whatever we decide is the right thing to do? Wow. Yeah. If there's no standard, how can we really know if we're doing the right thing, if we're being indifferent, if we're misusing life? So morality is pretty nebulous to the new ager, to the new spiritualist person. How can you establish a system of ethics that works for everyone? It's impossible, they said. We might be able to discern what's right for ourselves, but we can't know whether others are doing what's right for them. It seems incoherent. New spiritualists say, well, you're just not sufficiently oriented to the flow of consciousness. You're just too focused on how your thoughts will lead you to truth. Stop thinking. Get in touch with your true self. So then these two authors of this book say, so are the laws of logic just what we feel to be true? Is there ever a time when we should persuade others to act differently? And then what basis would we do this? Were Hitler and Stalin just expressing a different morality, or was it a wrong one? Can people grow in moral understanding over time? These are excellent questions. Here's the other worldview that we're dealing with these days, postmodernism. Postmodernism basically looks with suspicion on revelation, anything coming from God, and modern reason. They don't trust modern reason as a way to get to truth. So if you can't use revelation, you can't use human reason, what can you do? Well, one postmodernist says right action. Well, that's not real helpful. What constitutes right action? So some people say cultural relativism is the answer. Truth and morals are relative to one's culture. So I don't know. I think that's a tough one. So not all postmodernists agree with this, but in the final analysis, they say each community places moral standards on its members' action. Each culture has its own set of moral standards, and they evolve. So abortion, for example, at one time people were horrified by it in the West. Now it's accepted as maybe unpleasant but necessary. So the narrative has changed. So we have to get with the times, basically. But they said, what about if morality doesn't exist independent of our minds? I mean, Christian ethics start off, here's what God is like, and this is how we have to act. But was the New Agers say, the postmodernists, here's how we think we should act based on our story. So now let's develop a theory to accommodate it. So they start with their feelings and their story, and then they try to develop theory. It's kind of flipping it around. It's reverse thinking. All right, here's the last one of the worldviews they look at. It's Islam. So Muslims believe Islamic law is ethical by definition, and that ought to be enshrined in every nation's laws. So Muslims get their ethics from the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran has a lot of ethical commands, and the Hadith shows Muhammad as the exemplary human that Muslims should imitate. One author says Muhammad was only a mortal being commissioned by God to teach the Word of God and lead an exemplary life. He is a living proof of what man can be. So ethics is based on specific commands revealed from God. So it's kind of what they call a divine command theory. The idea that right and wrong are determined by God's commands, not the nature of God, right? That's Christianity, but what the commands are. They said, I thought this was funny. They said, you can imagine a Muslim wearing a bracelet stamped with WWMD. What would Muhammad do? So that's the only relevant ethical question for them. So why is he so important? Why is what he did so important? Well, the God of Islam is not knowable. So if you can't know him, you have to content yourself with his decrees. And how do you find out those decrees? In Muhammad. So basically, what does it come down to? What Muhammad says goes. So you got, what are some of the ethical things you got to do? Well, you got the 5 pillars of Islam. You got to not drink wine. You can't eat meat that hasn't been properly slaughtered. And there's a big long list. So Muslims are motivated toward ethical behavior to strengthen relationships, to anticipate the coming judgment. I mean, after all, for the Muslim, every human is going to stand before Allah and have the deeds weighed, and they do not know how it's going to come out for them. So that's really sad, isn't it? They have a fear of eternity in hell. They can't know for certain, with certainty, what God is requiring. So at the end of the day, they said it's pretty clear what goes for ethical behavior for a Muslim. They really don't have philosophical debates. It's just what it says in the Quran, and you're done. Well, what about Christianity? We'll finish up the chapter here. I've got, well, I'm going to go more quickly, I think, on this. But we say Christianity has a God that's not just a divine rule maker. He's made us in his image, but we're fallen. And so we know what things ought to be, but we can't live that way. So that's not the end of the story. Christ comes to us. So ethics is not an exercise of our own wills, but we're discovering a God who wills all and has exercised himself on our behalf. And the basic of Christian ethics is what Jesus said. We're supposed to love God and love our neighbor. And that word is agape, kind of love. So, have Christians done bad things? I mean, considering this is their standard? Yes, sure. But Christianity even has predicted this. They said because of sin, people are going to do evil things. So I think that's nice that they pointed that out. So remember, the Muslims believe moral norms are coming because it's God's decree. Marxists and secularists rely on either an economic or a naturalist philosophy. Postmodernists talk about community values. New spiritualists are getting their ethics from individually determined inner truth. But Christians see moral norms are coming from God's nature. It's from his character. So the task of Christian ethics then is to determine what conforms to God's character and what does not. So seeing right and wrong as objectively absolute, based on the nature and character of a person loving God, is superior, they said, to any other form of moral relativism. Yeah, I think that's true. It says at the base, Christian ethics are not complicated. Jesus says, whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. And what did Paul say in Romans? Let love be genuine, abhor what's evil. So where do moral absolutes come from? Well, we know it comes from the person of God himself. And so I think I will move along here and try to knock off this article. What's the Christian response? Here's the last section of the book here, or the chapter, the Christian response to relativistic moral systems. They said, if you look at all of these worldviews, they feel the greatest challenge to Christian ethics comes from secularism, Marxism, and postmodernism. Okay, so that's interesting. They said there's no final appeal if you don't have Christianity to judge between groups that have different moral judgments. We're just left with conflicting opinions. And they said the practical Achilles heel of relativism is pretty simple. If we all have conflicting opinions, if we all have subjective value judgments, what do? Flip a coin? No. It's going to be the most powerful that are always going to win, whether they're really right or wrong. There's a great article by Arthur Leff, and I don't have the time now to get into that, but he talks about that. He's not a Christian. He says, how do we determine what's moral? He said, we used to have kings determine it. That didn't turn out so well. Well, what about parliaments? No, that doesn't work either. Do we let the individual do it? No, we got chaos. So he says we're really stuck. If there's no God, where do we get the basis, the foundation for a moral system? So these two authors say we shouldn't start with the individual. We need to think about God's will as a starting point for moral understanding. So the idea that the self is an autonomous unit, which is so popular these days, is not good. It's really ruining us. Okay, so it says the understanding our obligation to God, this is wrapping it up here, is the only thing that gets us past relativism. God is truth. So it's always unlawful and morally wrong for a judge to take a bribe. We understand God is loving. So it's wrong for an adult to sexually abuse a child. So if ethical standards are just up to a culture, the best we can say is, well, right now, in this culture, it's a bad idea to take a bribe or abuse a child, but that doesn't work, does it? I mean, we know it's wrong no matter where, no matter when. Okay, let's see. I will end there. I think we're pretty much at the end of the chapter. But I just wanted to give you a feel for what this book is like. Again, it's called Understanding the Times. And I highly recommend it, especially if you're dealing with people that have different worldviews. We need to understand and not be defensive, but to be optimistic. Christianity provides a wonderful worldview. It's the best worldview going. Are there things that are frustrating and confusing or that I wish were a little more clear in the Bible? You bet. Are there Christians that don't live according to the standards that they need to? Yeah. But, one more time, the biblical worldview overall gives the best answers to what are humans, where do we come from, what problems are we in, how do we solve those problems. It's Christianity that gives the best answers. Well, thank you so much for being part of this podcast, and we'll do another one soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.